Elizabeth Masterson is sitting on a red chair in a lovely heavenly garden. A colleague shakes Elizabeth's shoulder, and it becomes clear she was having a dream during her medical shift. The colleague tells her she was asleep for 6 minutes. Elizabeth rushes to drink a wake-up coffee and proceeds to go through hospital cases. Elizabeth and one of her colleagues, Jenny, go to the older patient, Mr. Clark, who asks Elizabeth to marry him and informs her he even has his own bus pass. Elizabeth participates in the joke and answers that she only needs to take her sister's dress for the wedding. On a more serious note, she instructs Jenny to decrease the patient's morphine dose. Throughout the day, Elizabeth has a busy schedule dealing with a lot of different medical cases, such as fixing an injured arm, giving a tranquilizer, or playing with a pediatric patient. She quickly eats her lunch in between these cases and drinks a lot of coffee to keep herself alert and focused. During the break, in the girl bathroom, doctors are putting on their makeup and talk about various obligations that await them at home, such as having to sew caterpillar costumes for the kids or having to attend a dinner with the ex-husband's family. One of the doctors tells Elizabeth she is lucky to have only her work to worry about. Elizabeth takes a call from her sister Abby, who is calling to confirm a lasagna dinner for tonight. Abby also set up a date for Elizabeth and invited a family friend. Elizabeth is a bit reluctant to go on another failed date, but she confirms her attendance. Dr. Walsh, who is Elizabeth's boss, lets her know she has earned to stay on as an attending physician because she spends more time thinking about what's best for her patients than she does kissing his ass. He also tells her to go home and take a rest because she was working for the past 26 hours. As Elizabeth is on her way home, another colleague stops her to ask for her advice, and she agrees. In the parking lot, she meets Brad, who was competing with her for the role of an attending physician, who congratulates her and seems fine with Dr. Walsh's decision as he got another job offer in Phoenix. Elizabeth is driving in her car and calling Abby to apologize she is late for dinner, but also to excitedly let her know she got an attending position and will be staying in San Francisco. She finishes her call but then spots a truck driving in her direction. David is looking at the apartments with his real estate agent Grace. She takes him to a large spacey apartment that looks like a museum and a couple of more apartments, but he is not satisfied. The real estate agent sounds almost desperate as she can't figure out what it is that David is looking for. As they are standing on the street and discussing apartments, a pink flyer lands on David's head. David initially tries to ignore it but then reads it and realizes it's an advertisement for an apartment. They go to check out this nearby apartment, which has a great view, a fireplace, and a rooftop exit, and David likes the red couch. The real estate woman realizes a couch is important for David when choosing apartments. David is in his new apartment, drinking one beer after another and watching a video from a wedding when Elizabeth appears. She thinks David is a homeless man who broke into her apartment, and David thinks this was some kind of a rent fraud where the real estate agent rented the same apartment to more people. Elizabeth disappears as mysteriously as she appeared, and David puts a new lock on the entrance door and takes a shower. While he is observing himself in the bathroom mirror, he again sees Elizabeth's face and gets startled. David goes to meet his friend Jack, who is also a psychiatrist. David explains he's been seeing someone, and Jack mistakenly interprets it as David starting to date again after a 2-year gap. David explains he's been having some sort of hallucination of a blonde woman walking through his apartment. He also gets upset that Jack is writing his words down like they are in a therapy session. Jack believes it's time for David to stop hiding and start attending the dating scene again. Back in his apartment, David just had a shower and is preparing to go to bed when Elizabeth reappears. She asks him a ton of questions, such as whether he's been drinking recently and seeing a mental health professional. She explains all the items in the apartment, such as the stained pillow or the sheets, belong to her and tells David he is mentally sick. Elizabeth loses her patience and tries to call the police, believing there is an intruder in her home, but when she tries to reach the phone, she realizes she is unable to pick it up and her hand goes through the device. David calls his real estate agent and finds out there has been a tragedy regarding the previous owner, but he doesn't learn any details. He goes to an occult shop and buys a dozen books related to communication with ghosts. Once he gets back home, he follows the instructions and does a ghost summoning ritual, but nothing happens until he warns the ghost of Elizabeth. He will place a mug on the mahogany table without using a coaster. Elizabeth appears again and they continue their argument. David wants to know how she spends her days when she is not haunting his house, but she can't remember anything, and David concludes Elizabeth must be dead. Elizabeth refuses to believe him even though her body passes through the material objects in the house. She falls through the window wall but returns to the apartment the following second. David asks different types of exorcists to help him get the ghost of Elizabeth out of his home, but they mostly fail and most of them can't even see her. The guy from the occult bookstore comes by and has somewhat more luck in sensing Elizabeth's presence. He advises David to move out of the apartment and tells him he got into this mess because he needs to let the other girl go, the one in his heart. David and Elizabeth end up talking on the roof, and she apologizes and asks about the girl they were mentioning before. David tells her she was his wife, Laura. They go to the bar to join Jack and his friends, and David is looking pretty insane talking to Elizabeth as he is the only person that can see her. She stops him from ordering another glass of alcoholic drink and even haunts his body so he would leave the bar. They sit on the nearby bench and talk a bit more peacefully. Elizabeth asks him for help in finding out what happened to her. The following day, they go knocking on their neighbors' doors and asking if they remember the previous tenant. A girl wearing push-ups opens the door and tries to flirt with David. Elizabeth and David find some items in the apartment that could help with the search, and their search first takes them to dry cleaning service. The worker, not being able to see Elizabeth, tells David the piece of clothes that was left in his shop was given to a homeless shelter because the owner never came to pick it up. He also describes Elizabeth as being sad and a bit dull. Then the duo heads to the address that was written on the paper, but they mistakenly read the address number, and David ends up talking with a man who mistakes him for a private detective his wife hired. Elizabeth is now wondering if she had an affair in her previous life. David and Elizabeth enter a restaurant that seems familiar to Elizabeth, but she can't remember why she rarely ate there. One of the guests drops on the floor, and the people who gather around are asking for a doctor. Elizabeth instinctively reacts and gives the terrified David instructions to help the man. She wants David to make a small hole between the patient's ribs so he could breathe again. They save the man, and Elizabeth realizes she is a doctor who probably worked in the nearby hospital. Once Elizabeth and David enter the hospital, Elizabeth starts remembering the faces of the people who work there. They run into her mentor, who tells David Elizabeth had an accident 3 months ago and is in a coma. Elizabeth's memory starts returning, and David presents himself as Elizabeth's boyfriend so he would be allowed to ask about her medical state. Elizabeth tries to enter her old body and merge with it, but it doesn't work. She almost loses her faith, but David reminds her that his being able to speak to her is a miracle in itself. They say goodbye and David leaves the hospital. Abby's sister comes to the hospital with her kids to visit Elizabeth, and Dr. Brad, now a senior resident, informs her of the option of signing the papers to get Elizabeth off the life support system, as she was against it while she was conscious. Abby is confused but promises she will think about it. David is having dinner by himself, and his neighbor Katrina stops by and asks if she can stay for a while because she got locked out of her apartment. Upset about the life support discussion at the hospital, Elizabeth comes as well, hoping to speak to David, and sees Katrina almost without clothes in David's bedroom. David tells Katrina he is seeing someone and goes to Elizabeth, who is on the roof. David tells her how his wife died and some details of her personality that he cherishes. David decides to show Elizabeth the garden he once built and reveals he is a landscape architect. Elizabeth is enchanted by this garden that she saw in her dreams. David receives a call from Grace, the real estate agent, who lets him know he will get a full lease for the apartment as the family is planning to pull the plug on Elizabeth's life support system. Elizabeth and David go to talk to Abby, and David begs her to give Elizabeth more time, but Abby informs him she already signed the papers for terminating the life support. Desperate, David tries to tell Abby her sister is standing next to him, but Abby freaks out and drives him away from the house. Once one of her kids, Lily, mentions she also saw Aunt Elizabeth, Abby starts believing David. Elizabeth and David go talk to Daryl, the guy from the occult bookstore, and he advises David to keep asking the right questions. They go home and spend the night next to each other. Elizabeth believes David was her unfinished business and the reason why she didn't die, and David comes to realize Elizabeth saved him from losing his life due to severe alcohol consumption. David decides to move Elizabeth's body before they turn off the plug and brings Jack along to help him. As they are figuring out a way to do it next to Elizabeth's hospital bed, David discovers Jack once dated Elizabeth's sister Abby, and he even set him up on a date with Elizabeth just before her accident. Dr. Brad tries to stop the group from moving Elizabeth's body, but David kicks him in the face. As they are running from the security, Elizabeth's breathing device falls off. The ghost of Elizabeth starts fading away, and not knowing what to do, David kisses her. Elizabeth wakes wakes up from a coma, but she can't remember David. Elizabeth is moving back into her apartment and she feels something is missing, but can't say what. She climbs to the rooftop and finds a beautiful garden that David built. He returns the spare key to her. Elizabeth remembers everything and they kiss. In the occult bookstore, smiling Daryl seems to be picking on psychic vibes of a happy resolution between Elizabeth and David.